It's late summer, 985 AD. You're standing on Iceland's northern coast, watching the horizon. Your family has been watching for 6 weeks. The ship from Norway is late. In your storehouse, 3 months of dried fish. No timber to repair your leaking roof. No iron for tools. No grain for winter bread. No ship means no survival. This is the reality Hollywood never shows you. The Vikings who settled Iceland weren't rugged individualists conquering nature alone. They were nodes in a trade network stretching from Greenland to Constantinople. And every single one of them knew that their lives depended on a wooden hull appearing over the horizon before the autumn storms began. The myth of the self-sufficient Viking settler makes for compelling cinema. The truth is far more interesting and far more human. But this is the story of how trade kept an impossible colony alive. When the first Norse settlers arrived in Iceland around 870 AD, they found something remarkable. An island roughly the size of Kentucky, completely uninhabited, with no native population to trade with or learn from. The nearest established Norse settlement was over 600 miles away, across some of the most dangerous waters in the North Atlantic. Popular imagination paints these settlers as ultimate survivalists, men and women who carved existence from raw wilderness through sheer will and ingenuity. And there's truth in that image. They were extraordinary, but they weren't alone. Archaeological evidence tells a different story. Analysis of artifacts from Iceland's earliest settlement sites reveals materials that simply couldn't have originated on the island. Soapstone from Norway, bronze from continental Europe, wheat and barley that wouldn't grow in Iceland's climate. And perhaps most surprisingly, linen textiles that required flax, a crop that has never successfully grown in Icelandic soil. The numbers are stark. By 930 AD, approximately 10,000 settlers lived in Iceland. By 1100 AD, that population had grown to roughly 70,000. Yet the island's arable land, areas where crops could actually grow, represented only about 1% of its total landmass. The math doesn't work for isolated survival. Here's what the Vikings understood that we often forget. True survival isn't about needing nothing from anyone. It's about building systems that ensure you get what you need, when you need it, even when everything seems designed to kill you. The Norse didn't just settle Iceland. They integrated it into a trade network that stretched from the birch forests of Norway to the walrus hunting grounds of Greenland, from the wool markets of England to the luxury goods corridors of Byzantium. They turned an isolated volcanic rock into a viable node of medieval commerce. And they did it with nothing but wooden ships, astronomical knowledge, and an almost supernatural understanding of what other people wanted to buy. The Vikings didn't survive Iceland alone. They survived it together, through agreements made across 1,000-mile distances, through goods exchanged in harbors they'd never see, through trust built on reputations that traveled faster than any ship. Let's address the question that appears in every discussion of Viking Iceland. Where did the wood come from? When Norse settlers first arrived, roughly 25 to 40% of Iceland was covered in birch forest. By 950 AD, just 80 years later, most of it was gone. The settlers had cut it down for construction, fuel, and charcoal production. They weren't ignorant of consequences. They were desperate. Building a functional farmstead required enormous quantities of wood, and the trees were right there. The deforestation wasn't a failure of foresight. It was a calculated trade-off. Use local resources to establish the settlement quickly, then shift to imported timber for ongoing needs. And shift they did. Norwegian pine and oak began arriving in Iceland within decades of settlement. Ships from Bergen and Trondheim carried not just logs, but precisely cut construction timber, boards, beams, and planks sized for specific purposes. Archaeological analysis of Icelandic buildings from the 10th century onward shows a clear pattern. Local birch for rough construction, imported softwoods for structural elements that needed strength and durability. The trade route was 600 miles of open ocean, typically taking 4 to 7 days under favorable conditions. Ships would depart Norway in late spring, arrive in Iceland in early summer, and return before autumn storms made the crossing suicidal. The window was narrow, perhaps 12 weeks of viable sailing weather. But here's where it gets interesting. The Norse didn't just import timber from Norway. By the late 900s, our Icelandic ships were making regular journeys to the forests of Labrador and Newfoundland, a voyage of approximately 1,800 miles each way. Sagas refer to this region as Markland, literally forest land. Archaeological evidence from Lanso Meadows confirms Norse presence, and timber analysis from Greenland settlements shows North American wood species appearing in construction from this period. The Vikings had access to the largest timber reserves on Earth, the boreal forests of North America, 500 years before Columbus was born. Think about that logistics chain. An Icelandic farmer needed roof repairs. That wood might have grown in Newfoundland, been cut by Greenlanders, transported to Iceland's northern coast, then carried overland to his farmstead. The supply chain crossed 3,000 miles and required coordination between settlements that couldn't communicate faster than a ship could sail. The Vikings didn't just master shipbuilding. They mastered supply chain management across oceanic distances, using seasonal timing as their coordination mechanism. Iceland had exactly one native land mammal when the Norse arrived: the Arctic fox. This presents a problem that's easy to overlook. Viking-age Scandinavians relied heavily on fur, not as luxury, but as survival gear. Fur-lined cloaks, fur blankets, fur insulation in boots and gloves. In a climate where winter temperatures could drop to -30 Celsius, fur wasn't optional. Where did it come from? The answer reveals the true scale of Norse trade networks. Polar bear pelts arrived from Greenland, but where hunting parties targeted bears on the sea ice near modern-day Disco Bay. A single polar bear skin could be worth as much as a small farm. These weren't common goods. They were prestige items, often given as diplomatic gifts. King Harald Hardrada of Norway reportedly received Greenlandic polar bears as tribute from Iceland's chieftains. More practical for everyday use, seal skins from Icelandic waters, imported reindeer hides from Norway, and wolf pelts from Scandinavia. Analysis of textile remains from Icelandic archaeological sites shows a striking diversity of animal sources, far more variety than the local ecosystem could possibly provide. But fur wasn't Iceland's only textile challenge. Linen, the fabric used for undergarments, bedding, and sail reinforcement, requires flax, while flax requires a specific growing season and soil conditions that Iceland simply doesn't have. Every piece of linen in Viking Age Iceland was imported, primarily from Ireland and England. The economics worked like this. Iceland exported what it had in surplus: dried fish, wool products, sulfur, and falcons, and imported what it lacked. It sounds simple. It wasn't. Consider the timing problem. Icelandic wool became available after spring shearing. Norwegian timber ships arrived in early summer. Irish linen merchants operated on different schedules entirely. Coordinating these exchanges required sophisticated planning, credit arrangements, and trust between parties who might only meet face-to-face once per year. The Althing, Iceland's annual assembly, wasn't just a legal gathering. It was the largest trade fair in the North Atlantic. Merchants from Norway, Ireland, England, and even continental Europe would time their visits to coincide with this 2-week gathering in June. Goods were exchanged, debts settled, contracts negotiated for the following year. If you want to understand how Vikings survived, don't picture a lone warrior against the wilderness. Picture a trader at Thingvellir in midsummer, negotiating next year's timber delivery while selling this year's wool surplus, converting fish surplus into iron tools through 3 intermediate exchanges. That's the Viking survival system. That's how they made the impossible possible. Trade networks don't survive on charity. Iceland needed to offer something the outside world wanted. It offered several things, and one of them changed medieval European economics: walrus ivory. Before the 12th century, the primary source of ivory in Europe was elephant tusks from Africa, transported through Islamic trade networks. This ivory was expensive, supply was unreliable, and political conflicts frequently disrupted the trade routes. European craftsmen needed an alternative. They found it in the North Atlantic. Walrus tusks could be carved as finely as elephant ivory. In some applications, even more finely. And walrus hunting grounds in Greenland and northern Canada were accessible to Norse ships. By the late 900s, Icelandic and Greenlandic traders were supplying walrus ivory to markets across Europe. The famous Lewis chessmen, those iconic medieval chess pieces found in Scotland, are carved from walrus ivory, almost certainly sourced from Norse hunting grounds. Walrus ivory appears in religious artifacts, luxury goods, and high-status objects across medieval Europe. Isotopic analysis of ivory artifacts from this period increasingly confirms North Atlantic origins. Iceland itself had limited walrus populations, but it served as a crucial transshipment point. Ivory from Greenland passed through Icelandic ports en route to Norwegian markets and beyond. This made Iceland valuable not just for what it produced, but for where it sat in the trade network. Beyond ivory, Iceland exported what it could produce in surplus. Dried fish, stockfish, became Iceland's most reliable export. The combination of cold, dry winds and proximity to productive fishing grounds created ideal conditions for preservation. Icelandic stockfish could remain edible for years without refrigeration, making it perfect for long-distance transport and military provisioning. By the 13th century, stockfish had become one of Europe's most traded commodities. Sulfur from Iceland's volcanic regions found markets throughout Europe, used in textile production, medicine, and early gunpowder manufacturing. Falcons from Iceland were prized throughout medieval Europe and the Islamic world. A well-trained gyrfalcon could be worth as much as a warship. Icelandic chieftains cultivated falcon populations and controlled their export carefully. These were diplomatic weapons as much as hunting birds and wool. Icelandic sheep developed unique characteristics adapted to harsh conditions. Long outer coats for weather resistance, soft inner fleece for insulation. Vadmal, the distinctive Icelandic wool cloth, became a standardized trade good, used as currency throughout the North Atlantic region. But legal documents from this period specify values and debts in Vadmal lengths. It was literally money woven from sheep. Here's what this means. Every piece of wool worn by an Icelandic family represented a decision. Sell it for imported timber, trade it for iron tools, convert it to linen for undergarments. The economy of survival meant constantly calculating what you needed against what you could produce. The Vikings weren't just traders. They were sophisticated economic actors, maximizing value from limited resources across vast distances. Everything I've described sounds remarkably efficient. It wasn't. The system was terrifyingly fragile. Ships sank. The North Atlantic claimed vessels every year. Storms, ice, navigation errors. Each lost ship meant lost goods, lost lives, and broken supply chains. and families who had counted on specific deliveries suddenly had nothing. Timing failures cascaded. A late departure from Norway meant a late arrival in Iceland. A late arrival meant less time for trading. Less trading meant return voyages pushed into dangerous autumn weather. One delay could ripple across the entire network. Political disruptions severed routes entirely. When Norway's civil wars intensified in the 12th and 13th centuries, Iceland's timber supply became unreliable for decades. When relations with England soured, the linen trade suffered. Iceland's survival depended on peace in places Icelanders had never visited. Climate change proved catastrophic. Beginning around 1300 AD, the medieval warm period ended and the Little Ice Age began. Sea ice expanded, shortening sailing seasons. Growing seasons contracted, reducing both local food production and exportable surplus. The Greenland colonies, Iceland's connection to North American timber and walrus ivory, collapsed entirely by 1450, victims of the same climatic shift. The Black Death, arriving in 1402, killed approximately half of Iceland's population. The trade network didn't just lose traders, it lost the knowledge of how to maintain relationships, navigate routes, and negotiate complex exchanges. Recovery took generations. What had seemed like ingenious adaptation revealed itself as profound vulnerability. A society that can't survive without external inputs, can't survive when those inputs disappear. And yet, they survived. The population declined, the trade routes contracted, the golden age ended. But people remained. They adapted again, relying more on fishing, less on farming, and rebuilding networks on smaller scales. The lesson isn't that trade networks fail. The lesson is that survival systems must be resilient to their own vulnerabilities. The Vikings built remarkably sophisticated networks. They also built dependencies that nearly destroyed them when conditions changed. We began with a myth. The Viking settler as ultimate individualist, conquering nature through personal courage and ingenuity. The truth is more interesting. The Vikings who settled Iceland were brave. Crossing the North Atlantic in open boats requires courage we can barely imagine. They were ingenious, building functional societies on volcanic rock with almost no natural resources. But they were also deeply, fundamentally connected. Their survival depended on ships arriving from Norway, on walrus hunters in Greenland, on wool traders in England, on flax farmers in Ireland, on relationships maintained across thousands of miles of ocean, renewed annually through brief summer meetings, sustained through the long, dark winter on nothing but trust. This isn't a lesser achievement than individual survival. It's a greater one. Building systems that work, systems that deliver timber to treeless islands and linen to flax-free shores, systems that convert fish into tools and wool into winter clothing, requires something more than personal strength. It requires the ability to see beyond yourself, to understand what others need, to build trust across distances where betrayal would never be punished. The Vikings mastered this. They built trade networks spanning from North America to Constantinople, coordinated without telecommunications, navigated without GPS, maintained without written contracts. They turned an isolated volcanic island into a viable human settlement for over 1,000 years. That's not survival despite connection. That's survival through connection. If this exploration of Viking trade networks revealed something you didn't know, consider subscribing. Next, we're exploring what happened when these networks reached their breaking point and how the descendants of Vikings adapted when the ships stopped coming. The Vikings built their world on wooden hulls and human trust. Both proved more fragile and more resilient than anyone expected.